Hello and welcome to a new entry of the High Tech Low Code podcast. Today we're going to talk about sports and technology. And to help us with that subject, we were able to invite Siobhán Heaton and Gary Williams. Siobhán is a senior software tester with extensive work experience in sports. Siobhán, thank you very much for joining us in this episode of the podcast. How are you doing? And could you do a small introduction about yourself?
Sure. I'm doing really well, thanks. So as you said, I'm a software tester. I've been working in technology for about 10 years now and in sports-specific technology for 6 or 7 of those years.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Following Siobhán, we have Gary. Now, Gary is an experienced automotive design engineer, OutSystems low-code developer, product inventor, and previous podcast co-host. Thank you very much for joining us again. How are you doing, Gary? What have you been up to?
Hi, Mario. Yes, I'm well, thanks. I've been busy. Work's quite busy. We've got lots on at the moment. And other than that, I've been homeschooling my 2 primary school children and learning lots about the things they're up to. Fronted adverbials, things that... phrases, really, I guess, and sort of terminology that I'm not used to, but I've been thrown in the deep end with that. And other than that, actually refereeing fights between the 2 of them. And I'll certainly be glad when they go back to school.
I love it. So talking about our subject of the day, technology has helped develop and push the envelope in many different industries, from farming to health. But a sector where we don't usually think of technology is in sports. So talking about technology in sports, where does it start and where does it end? We know that tech has always played a role in sports gear, for example. Nowadays, athletes use Fitbits, wristbands, and all kinds of analytic tools to improve their performance. In your opinion, how big is the impact of digital technology nowadays?
Yeah, I'll go first, Mario. I've got a different take, probably from Siobhán's angle. Mine's more really around my background in sort of manufacturing, and specifically automotive. And the things that I've experienced firsthand, manufacturing and test of equipment. So just to put it in context, athletes obviously use Fitbits and things like that to improve their performance. And I think that's just one aspect of it. My side of interest really is all about the manufacturing process and how technology has improved that whole life cycle of a part and a design. So take an example of a race car, for instance, and the olden day process would have been to sketch something out on paper, make some parts, prove those parts out on the car, and that whole process will be quite lengthy and a cost involved in that. Whereas the tech these days, designing the parts in 3D, applying all the technology advances that we've got in that sort of design cycle of just creating the part in the first place in 3D is a great thing, but then applying materials to it, pushing it on into the CAE packages, the computer-aided engineering processes, so where we can look at things like fluid dynamics, cooling, predictions really of models, and the correlation over time between if you tested a part in real life for a certain type of test versus the digital twin, as it's known, the digital version of that test, the correlation, the results, the quality of those results has improved so much over time that there's really good understanding and belief in those numbers that come out, and it just reduces the whole design side cycle. And I was watching a video about Williams' race team not so long ago where they were doing some modifications, designing the part in 3D, pushing it through their CAE process, and then from that put it straight into an F1 simulator that they had, and they could program that simulator to change the performance of the vehicle, and they could predict whether that design change would be of use or not, with what the benefits were. So straight into the simulator, in test, and that whole cycle, none of it was a physical part made at all. It was all digital. And that process can just take you through from first theming of an idea to actually putting a real part on a car, but trying to get it right first time is not always the case. But it's that process is now much shorter, and also on the side of the actual technology that is used to produce these results, the HPC improvements, so the available computing power, these high performance computers, the software meshing models, there's so much they can do. You can even predict how something will sound where dirt will splatter on a car if it goes through some grit, where the stone rash might be, reflections on the headlights, reflections in the driver's cockpit, all manner of things can all be simulated, and that process and that technology is growing in leaps and bounds. So that's the design side of things. But then when you think about the next step, which is the actual manufacturing of parts, again, in the olden days, you'd have a drawing, or even if you had a CAD model, you'd still have to maybe program an NC machine, make those parts, make jigs and fixtures to hold those parts. It'd still be a long process. But now with the advent of 3D printers, which I know have been around for a while, but the materials that these things can actually produce parts out of nowadays aren't these flimsy little plastic things. Actually, you can actually produce workable, usable parts out of steel, for instance, carbon fibre. All sorts of materials can be injected into the sort of base resin, and the quality of parts in terms of accuracy and the robustness of them means, again, they can take a 3D design straight into some CAE testing to prove what they think it might do in the real world, but then actually make a real part all very quickly without any tooling. All that lead time is really compressed. So the technology in all that, for me, is really, really interesting, and it's just really pushing on, and it's great to see. And I'm sure I'll hand over to Siobhán now. I'm sure she's got a different take on her side of things from her experience.
Well, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you mentioned in the changes and the way that they can feed into things like simulators, so that whether it's drivers or athletes in other fields are able to then sort of have that training and practice in a safe environment, and that they're aware of those changes before before they go out and do it for real and risk injury or anything like that. So that, I think's made a big difference. And I think the wearables part that you mentioned, Mario, that if we look at what's available at the consumer level now, things, the Apple Watch being able to track your blood oxygen level and give an ECG reading and things like that, it's incredible to think that, Fitbits were sort of the forefront of wearable technology 8-9 years ago, and then you look at how quickly that's evolved from just tracking your steps and your, how effectively you're sleeping, whether or not you're moving too much in your sleep, and then you look at what we have now at the consumer level. So then at the professional level, what these athletes are able to monitor. So it's one thing having sports science labs at their clubs or the international associations, but now they can be given equipment to take home so that they're able to monitor. They have proper sensors within their mattresses so that they know how well they're sleeping, more so than just, are they rolling over? Is their wrist moving much? Having proper health readouts for things that they could, it's not a case of having a doctor come in once a week and having a professional medical person review that they're able to monitor so much of their day-to-day performance and rest as well, and recovery. So there's just been huge leaps where there's the budget for it. At least it's made a real difference, I think.
I'm just imagining those sensors for the sleeping. This guy's a tosser.
You can't say that much.
I mean, it's
you have to put that.
Like the cycling teams are really quick to cotton on to the impact of rest and recovery. And so I think it's, Team Sky were one of those teams that started for things like the Tour de France. They were shipping the same mattresses for every location. So they were traveling with those on buses or lorries for their riders to make sure they had that they could replicate the same sleep environment day after day.
Wow.
And, you think of that extra cost and the logistics of having to move that stuff. And
Yeah.
I think some teams would write it off, but
yeah, I mean, there's the fact of taking your favorite pillow, yes, but your mattress. Oh, wow, that's quite an insight. Do you reckon that there are any big trends that we have to keep an eye on for technology and sports?
Yeah, I read an article recently. It was all about data monetization in the sports industry, and it was a Deloitte article, I think it was. And it was all about the fan engagement, player and team performance, and sports betting, and the market for this sort of data and aggregators was just basically talking about it heating up and increasingly employing data analytics to guide decision making and support for marketing and that kind of thing. So in terms of fan engagement, it was all about data-driven platforms and artificial intelligence to sense the sentiments of fans, analysing the data to better understand fan behaviour and connect with those fans in a very specific way to generate a better fan experience and more expectation that with that sort of ability to engage with the right fans. You can fuel the monetization in an integrated sort of e-commerce and socially active platform within the whole fan ecosystem. So more than ever before, the big data side of things is being used in sports to get those insights from the fan side of things, but obviously the player metrics and team performance, and those insights are changing how games are played, managed, and the money side of things. And this is the thing that really stuck out to me, was that according to the research, the sports analytics industry is expected to reach nearly $4 billion by 2023 as those teams and coaches, broadcasters and rights holders harness that data to improve performance and connect with the fans. And it's an eye-watering amount of money, but you can see how this big data is really influencing the way that teams and sport works in that arena, in the live events and the prediction models.
Oh my gosh. And they're debating if they should spend $1.9 billion in care package. Well, I'm going to call it care.
Yeah.
In care package for COVID in America. They're debating it. Should we do it?
It's I was at a talk from some guys from KPMG, and they were talking about the, fan engagement and how to monetize it. This was about 5 years ago, and they were talking about so one of the ways that I think lots of people think about technology in sport is the potentially negative side, things like VAR in football, and they can see it as interfering if there's a video referee and it takes ages for a decision to be made, and it might go against your team and what have you. But these guys at KPMG were basically saying that you can use facial recognition technology in cameras that kind of scans the crowd, and you can see when it goes from kind of tentative excitement through to the turning point where they've had enough of waiting and they just want the answer. And one of the things they were proposing doing was kind of selling this data so that, a fast food company could choose to sponsor that particular stadium or that team or that match. Then when the decision's being made, you'd have like a, spinning bucket of chicken or whatever it is. And then at the point that you see the crowd turn, then you announce the decision. So just before they've kind of lost all will, it would then be, the tries awarded or the goals awarded.
Oh, there's a special place for people.
Yeah, it's like a real sinister turn.
Yeah. Oh, man. Can you imagine? Oh, yeah, let them wait just a few more seconds. And while we're doing that, we're selling publicity space. Ta-da! That's quite a turn of events.
That just reminds me of that film Ready Player One. And one aspect of that is the baddies are trying to take over the virtual world, the Oasis, with the plan of selling all the real estate on the screen for all the advertising, and a lot of the screenshots around that particular scene were all about, there was hardly any screen left of the actual game itself. There was just these adverts that were all served just to purely monetize the whole thing. I know it's an extreme version of what we just talked about, but it's just it just shows you where the thoughts are along with that. This big data and monetizing just the sentiment of people and serving those adverts in the right place at the right time. It's quite scary when you think about it.
Well, I mean, if we really think about it, we probably are not that far away from that, with Facebooks and Instagrams and whatnot, everything being interconnected. Yeah, probably not. It's scary. The more I think about it.
It feels like sports falling into the same trap as, wider society. People see value in data, but they haven't quite worked out what that value is. So they're harvesting so much of it. And it's whether or not that data is actually going to fuel good decisions. Is it going to change a team's approach or an individual athlete's approach to something? Or are they just gathering that data and then it's clouding their decision making? And I think it's happening in all areas. It's certainly not unique to sport.
It's like you say, even with the facial recognition now, we are starting to reach a point where we're starting to trace a profile in the trends of what people like and don't like, and how to control those trends. Scary stuff. Picking up from that one, what lessons can we take from the technology used in sports and applied in other sectors? Any ideas for that?
There was an Irish startup that were looking at developing something that they were pitching as basically a Fitbit for cows.
Okay, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
It was a sensor Yeah, it was a sensor that could basically provide information to do with that cow's general health, like its nutritional needs, its temperature, whether it was taking enough fluids on board, all that kind of thing, so that you would know how well it was performing in terms of the milk it was capable of delivering that day, and on a weekly basis. And so I think there's potential for overlap industries that you wouldn't expect, like farming.
Even to control and trace where the animals are in your pig farm, that's a good thing.
Yeah, so security is always big news, isn't it? It's around all the time. There's always some kind of news headline about hacking into corporations, data being stolen, more recently into the election processes. So there's this data that's swimming around everywhere, and arguably lots and lots of data is being collected because it can, and it's being collected and kept because it can. And sometimes there's no use for that data yet, but it's being kept maybe because there might be some use for it in the future, I guess. But clearly, everybody's got to be careful about that. And from a sporting side of aspect, confidentiality of this data, getting that data into the wrong hands, your competitors' hands, when you've just developed something that's a great innovation on a particular part of the car or whatever. Teams have got to have that protected. Everybody needs that protected for those aspects, the intellectual property aspects. So I would think it's high up on the agenda of most people, and as it should be too.
What about the security on this type of information? Do you reckon that does it have any consideration in sports?
I think it's one of those that it's an ongoing conversation, I'd say, for in lots of sports. And there's some high profile football teams, for instance, that are very paranoid about security, and therefore everything that they collect is on-prem. They'll make sure that is stored at their training ground on dedicated servers, and they refuse to engage with any kind of cloud technology because they don't want to be susceptible to having that data hacked. And they feel that it would make them too vulnerable if it's something that's kind of stored in the cloud. Whereas for others, they're looking at cost and what they can do. And so, they're happy to store all of their video and analysis in the cloud. But I think another area that's interesting is around who owns that data. So if you're looking at an individual athlete's output, their physical output, and you're looking at health metrics, is that data owned by the athlete themselves? It's their health and their vital statistics, as it were. And does it belong to the technology provider that's built the hardware and the software? Or does it belong to the club because it's their athlete and they're under contract? And it becomes messy when you're looking at sports where athletes represent a club, but also potentially their country as well. And there could be a conflict over what data can be, if it's a club staff that also provide the analysis services for the national team, and giving those members of staff insight into their competitors at a club level. There's a lot that is very, it's a real grey area.
I never thought about that. Okay, you have the club, but then you go represent the country. It gets mixed. Oh yeah, that like you said, that is a gray area. I would imagine that depending on the sport, this would vary in priority, the security related with data.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would imagine that, I don't know, I'm not good with sports, but maybe hockey, for example, it's not that important, but football, it's severe, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely. And it's strange because it's one of those that there's communities of these analysts, they all know each other. They were at university together, or they've worked at clubs in previous jobs together, or they've been at the same tournaments, and they see each other a couple of times a year at repeat fixtures. But whereas in a sport like hockey, the games are played at a much faster turnaround. So you're likely to be playing every day in a World Cup rather than once or twice a week, which is what happens in football. And so in hockey, you would be that there's no kind of third-party data provider that's providing generic statistics on every match like you have in football or rugby or basketball. And so you would have a bank of hockey analysts from every country that's at that World Cup, and they're just watching all of the games every day in case their team is going to be drawn against one of them. And so all of those analysts can see what is on each other's screens. They know what they're looking for and what different events they're tracking. Whereas football, they're quite far apart. That sometimes there'll be entirely different sections of the stadium. Some might be inside, and they'll make the opponent analysts be outside in the cold. There's some mind games that can happen where you're just trying to, same as you do for the opposition changing rooms, that, turn the heating off and things like that, just, to try and gain an edge. Yeah.
On another note that just occurred to me, like Gary was saying, in motorsports, there the security has to be high. We're talking about prototypes, state-of-the-art technology. That is an example where I would imagine, something blew up, cover it. We cannot let the competition see this broken.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a marshal some years ago at Alton Park, the race circuit in Cheshire. Showing my age now, this was back in the early 90s. And it was the time the JPS Norton came out, and it came into the biking arena, and it was just doing so well. That team looked great, they performed well, it was just doing so well, and it was their Wankel engine, so it was kind of, even though it wasn't brand new technology, it was new within this sort of sphere really of the bike racing. And I was on a particular sector when one of these JPS Nortons went down, and ordinarily when a bike went down, we just run out and pick up the bits, obviously make sure the rider's okay and make sure the circuit is safe, but we'd pick up those parts to the bike and just pull them to one side. Now, when this bike went down, the pit crew were there in no time at all, making sure they got absolutely every single part of that bike back. They were so protective over it. And it all comes down to money, doesn't it? And in intellectual property, they'd obviously pumped so much money into developing their bike, and it was doing so well. And the last thing that they could afford to have is people finding a part, and getting into the wrong hands. And suddenly your IP is out in the public domain, or with a competitor, which is worse, I guess. And they're making these parts, or understanding the way that you're making your bike work faster.
Yeah, keeping the secret sauce a secret. What could drive tech in sports? Remember the movie Moneyball? That was an interesting way to revolutionize the way the game was being played. So what's your take on this? What could drive a change in sports and technology?
I think it feeds into the data collection we've mentioned earlier, in that with Moneyball, it was looking at available, data that was available to everyone, but they were looking at it in a different way and asking a completely different set of questions. It's interesting that the structure of teams in America is very different to in the UK, for instance. So in America, you'll have a general manager, and they'll tend to oversee the trading of players and the whole makeup of that team, but they're not kind of hands-on with the day-to-day coaching side of it. Whereas we don't really take that approach in the UK. It tends to be that whether it's a strategist for a racing team or a football manager, they're very hands-on with the drivers and the players and what have you. That they know who those people are, and they've tended to have careers involved in that particular sport. Whereas in the US, the general managers could be business students with their college degrees, could have absolutely nothing to do with that particular sport. There's just, I don't know what how they found themselves in that role, but it's interesting that they have asked these questions, and kind of that film really did shine a light on the importance of data and what you can do beyond just the stats for the game itself.
It just occurred to me, imagine big data AI analyzing all the sports stats from any specific sport and suddenly coming up with strategies that we never thought about it. That could be a close future, or maybe it's happening now and we're not aware of.
Yeah, so Moneyball is an example of that sort of new way of thinking and approaching a problem from a completely different aspect. So in terms of tech and sports, if you think about F1 and the caps on spend to try and level the playing field, you clearly need to use tech, or anything that you do, it's got to be done to improve your lap times, and it's all got to be clever and smarter. So that tech could improve a lap time. So finding unique ways to improve the way you do things could be that difference between winning or losing. And when you're looking at the small amounts of time differences that you need to be a winner versus a loser, it's certainly achievable, I guess, even a slight change in something. So Moneyball showed that benefit, and it can be realized from that fresh approach.
Yeah, good point. Jumping to something closer to home, so to speak, with COVID-19, how could tech help sports monetize the events and bring back the sports to the fans?
For me, one of the interesting things is that you can look to, if there are restrictions in place in terms of how many analysts can attend fixtures, then I know that there's work that's been done to enable streaming of matches so that the analysts can work from training grounds or their homes. So if that means that if the staff aren't having to travel, that saves time and money so that they can actually work on, they can do what they want to do, which is analyze the games. They don't want to be traveling hours and hours in each direction. So it frees up more time for them to actually create meaningful analysis, but also will save the club some money. And that's money that could be reinvested in other areas. So whether that is hiring data scientists and looking to do more in that field or in other areas, I think COVID could have that sort of impact where it would force clubs to kind of reevaluate where they're spending their money and what's worth it ultimately. In terms of bringing fans back, I don't know if you've got any insight there, Gary?
Yes, I'm aware of some technology that's pretty good that is trying to get people back into sports grounds again. So there's a way of making sure that the people that are in attendance, which even if there's no fans, you've still got the teams and the staff, the arena staff, safety people, all manner of people that are needed just to hold an event even without fans. But there's ways of tagging people so that people's movements can be monitored to make sure there are no proximity violations, the right numbers of people are where they should be, and all that can be audited and managed, even down to the point of where these people are staying in the hotels, and just making sure that everybody's safe, and we do have that quick, safe return to sports events.
Glad to know that is in the foreseeable future. With that, we reach the end of our episode. Thank you very much, Siobhán and Gary, for taking time off your schedule to participate in this episode of the podcast. And as usual, also a big thank to everyone who is listening, and hope you can join us on our next episode of High Tech Low Code Podcast, where, as always, we'll feature more guests and talk about more topics of importance to the tech world. See you soon.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you. See ya. Bye.